Ahoy! I don't know how to start this video because I have no way of summarizing just how good the Greatsword is. So instead, let's get right into why you should definitely be running Greatsword if you're looking for damage next patch. To quickly explain what we're focusing on here, we're looking at the maximum damage per second possible, both with light attacks as well as heavy attacks, but also with abilities and weaving it all together. First, we need a bit of a frame of reference. We need to know how much damage per second is possible with some other weapons to understand how the Greatsword is in comparison. We're gonna leave out ranged weapons here because their DPS in general is lower. That's a topic for another time. If you're looking at melee weapons towards the mid-lower end, for example, you have the Warhammer, which has a maximum of 7,124 damage per second from spamming light attacks. The high end that we looked at in a previous video was the Hatchet with 9,872 DPS, and even higher than that, the Sword and Shield, which could reach a total of 10,581 DPS between attacks and abilities. By the way, thanks to quite a few of you for pointing out that Bane perks stack on both Sword and Shield. Since this is only available on mutation drop shields that cannot roll rogue, the overall DPS increase from this would be very minor, but there is a possible DPS increase to maybe around 11,000 if everything goes perfectly. But I'll be honest with you, that doesn't really matter much considering what the Greatsword is capable of. Just to give you a bit of a taste at this point, in its weakest form, with Path of Defiance active, which reduces the damage of the Greatsword, it still has higher damage per second than the current strongest weapon in the game. I figured it would be best to start this with a little bit of a visual demonstration before we get into the talent trees. So here's just a little bit of a comparison between the Hatchet at its max DPS versus the Greatsword. Both of these are very similar and most of the perks don't apply for the test dummies here, the only difference being that the Greatsword has transient crits, whereas the Hatchet has keen. But what you can already see is that just rolling between these dummies, with the Hatchet it takes me significantly longer to take a dummy down to the point where it becomes damage immune, and by the time I'm done with the next one I could technically go back to the other one before and I would have health again. With the Greatsword, not so much. So how do we make that possible, given that we're already using an optimized DPS tree for the Hatchet? For that we need to look into the skill tree for the Greatsword. There are quite a few perks that are important here. The first one, our foundation, is Path of Onslaught. This increases our damage dealt and taken by 15% and makes our heavy attacks twice as fast, but also use 10 stamina per attack. Another perk that goes along with this is Aggressive Shift, which allows us to enter the Onslaught stance by attacking with a charged heavy attack. So between those and our abilities, we will never lose the Onslaught stance, which is important to keep the extra damage and accelerated heavy attacks. The capstone perk Unrelenting Onslaught in the Onslaught tree is also extremely important, since it reduces all of our cooldowns by 10% with every charged heavy attack, which means we can rotate our abilities much more often. This means that we can reach 100% uptime on Relentless Power, the first perk after Relentless Rush, because this gives you 10% empower for 10 seconds, and if you're constantly heavy attacking, your cooldowns are short enough to use this again within 10 seconds. Step and Strike can provide us with an additional 10% empower for the next 3 hits within 10 seconds after dodging, but we won't even be using this in the calculation because with things like Oblivion, you should be empower capped, especially in dungeon runs anyways. But for PvP, for example, obviously, this is an additional benefit. We're also maxing out Crosscut entirely, not only to get grit on the attacks, but also to get Cross Execution, which will give us additional damage against target below 75% health. The relevant trees from the Defiance tree are Blade Honing, which increases your base damage by 3% for each Greatsword buff on you, but for the calculations we're only gonna assume one Greatsword buff on you. Obviously, at times you will have more. The second perk that we absolutely want here is Unflinching Blade, which gives us a bleed that can stack up to 5 times with each heavy attack we're doing. In the Onslaught tree, we need to pick up a few additional perks to even reach the capstone. The one that is going into the calculation is Crush the Weak, which gives an additional 10% critical strike chance while targets are debuffed, and everyone is always going to be debuffed by something. So the complete skill tree will either look like this or like this, depending on if you want to go for Skyward Slash or Calamity Counter. I will talk about the benefits of those later. As you can see, there are still a few points left that you can spend according to your liking. These are not factored into the calculation because they either don't add any benefit or they are just too difficult to factor in. For example, Giant Slayer gives you 20% damage to targets above 90% health, but how long a target stays above 90% health can be vastly different depending on their health and what kind of target we're talking about, so it's pretty much impossible to factor in. Next, let's have a look at the DPS values. For that, I need to thank and credit a few people. The main calculations for this and the main theory crafting, the measuring of the timings, was done by XR. The damage calculator that has all the formulas and values that was used to create this was made by Mixed Nuts. And I'd also like to credit Curatius, who gave XR the recordings for him to actually measure all the frame timings. You will also see a few of those in this video later. Here's a quick overview of the effects used for pretty much all of these DPS tests anyways. And what is notable here is that the perks we're using on the Greatsword are Thwarting Strike, Angry Earth Bane, assuming against an Angry Earth target, and Keenly Jagged, which is pretty much consistent with what we've been using on the sword. The Hatchet had Rogue instead, but similar numbers anyways. Let's begin with the least favorable scenario for the Greatsword. We have our light attacks and our heavy attacks here, which don't all have the same animation speed or scaling. That's why there's the light attack 3 and charge heavy 3. And what you can see in the overall DPS is that we have 9,300 DPS with the light attacks, roughly 7,700 with the heavy attacks. But this is while we have Path of Defiance active, so we actually dealing less damage and we don't get the accelerated heavy attacks. A hatchet doing the same left click spam would deal 9,500 DPS and the sword would deal 10,250 DPS. So at this point the Greatsword is not winning yet. But what's different about the Greatsword is that the abilities actually add a significant amount of extra DPS, especially crosscut. Also, all of your heavy attacks apply bleeds, which is an additional extra damage boost. Factoring all of that in, while in Defiant stance, using heavy attacks, which actually have the lower DPS than light attacks here, we would already sit at 11,188 DPS. And that is only even possible if you intentionally leave out certain perks and immediately switch back to Defiant stance whenever you get switched over by an ability, which you would never really do. If we are instead entirely without a stance, then our DPS goes up to 12,083 already. At this point, the heavy attack is still weaker than the light attack. So even in Defiant stance or stanceless, the Greatsword is already stronger than any other weapon in the game. But now let's really slam it down and see what happens if we go into the Onslaught stance, get our extra 15% damage and get our accelerated heavy attacks. First thing you notice is that the heavy attack DPS now massively outweighs the light attack DPS. We're looking at 12,793 DPS, meaning that just by spamming heavy attacks, you're already doing more damage than any other weapon in the game. But you have to remember, we have a perk that allows us to reduce all of our cooldowns by 10% with every heavy attack, and our heavy attacks are now twice as fast, so our cooldowns are gonna go down very, very quickly. In combination with all the additional damaging perks that we have, we reach a total DPS of 15,498. That is more than 1.5 times as much as the hatchet. But it doesn't even end there. There is also a perk that I specifically didn't talk about before, which you may have noticed, which is Heavy Blade. Heavy Blade, charged heavy attacks have 15% armor penetration. This obviously comes into play here, but because we are testing DPS in a vacuum, we don't have a target that has a specified armor value. The difference of this will be more noticeable against targets with higher armor, but either way, you're getting this 15% armor penetration on a lot of your damage on top of everything else. There are also other factors that you could use to increase the damage even further, but those are not just Greatsword things. Like for example, you could get Flame Attunement instead of Keenly Jagged, that will be more damage. You could get the Rune Glass Bleed effect, which we'll have in the next patch. You could use your Rune, your Detonate Rune in between, which is relevant for the Greatsword because the Greatsword is one of the quickest weapons to stack this through his bleeds ticking up the stacks for runes in general constantly. So that will be another massive damage increase that especially affects the Greatsword. And we also have to point out here that the Greatsword is an AoE weapon. All of its swings are very wide except the first heavy attack, and many of its abilities are also able to hit multiple targets. What's really nice about the Greatsword is that it doesn't need any weapon perks for DPS. It has very interesting weapon perks for PvP, but these are not important for damage output itself. So if you're looking to just deal damage with this, you can simply switch out your weapon, your hatchet, in a strength dex set for the Greatsword, and that's pretty much all you have to do. What we still need to address is the Skyward Slash versus Calamity counter situation. From a raw damage per second perspective, neither of these abilities is actually good because they both deal less damage than just spamming heavy attacks. But both of them come with their own benefits. Calamity counter gives you an extremely strong block that's essentially a damage immunity, whereas Skyward Slash applies a rend to enemies. Calamity counter has the benefit of being a very nice quick safety switch when you are running a glass cannon build. It can also apply bleeds, and it has the added benefit of kinda letting your build double a bit more as a PvP build as well. Now, crosscut isn't really a PvP ability, but overall, between those three abilities that you'd have at that point, you'd still be okay for PvP without having to switch your build every single time you're playing PvP versus PvE. Skyward Slash's benefit is that it may allow you to permanently stay on the Greatsword for DPS without ever switching to your secondary weapon, because everything would be a DPS loss at that point. Normally your offhand would likely be a spear to apply extra rends, but if you have one Voidblade user in your entire group, then you don't actually need that. You can rend cap between Skyward Slash and the Voidblade. By the way, the upgrades to that ability are likely a damage loss compared to just heavy attacking, unless you are looking for the anti-heal effect. With the DPS values now being known, most dungeon runs will likely have 3 or more Greatswords most of the time, and realistically you only need one person to use Skyward Slash on cooldown. Due to a reduction from heavy attacks, the cooldown is actually shorter than the duration of the rend. Having Calamity counter instead can help in certain boss situations and mob groups, and kinda makes up for the fact that you don't have the invulnerability of the Hatchet. While we have now established that the Greatsword is the absolute king of DPS and will likely stay that way for quite a while, there are also some other things to discuss that are not necessarily all favorable for the Greatsword. The Greatsword has some problems in PvP, revolving around guarded shift and perfect block as well, and there are also some other things that are absolutely worth talking about, like the tracking, which is another story in itself. That would, however, break the framework of what I can fit into one video, so if you'd like to see that, please consider subscribing and clicking the bell so you get notified. We'll also talk about more DPS related things soon, such as light and heavy attacking for different weapons and range DPS, so if you'd like to see that, same thing. Now, while I unfortunately can't give you access to XR's version of the DPS calculations, because that is a modified version, I can tell you where you can find the general DPS calculator and damage calculator that is already updated for Brimstone Sands by Mixed Nuts. That will be linked in the description down below. If you want to test around with that, you just have to make a copy. Thanks to XR, Mixed Nuts and Kuratius for making this video possible, and thank you for watching. Duke, out.